For starters, apologies for the rough voice. I've been dealing with some really bad allergies, and possibly a cold. I don't even know. It was pretty bad, but yeah, the voice isn't doing too hot right now. But anyway, in my paper, I wanted to take a deeper look at how different ethical theories respond when people are put under extreme moral pressure, when survival is at stake and choices are forced. And one of the best fictional representations of this kind of moral crisis, at least in my view, is the ferry problem from The Dark Knight. That scene where the two ferries, one filled with civilians and the other filled with prisoners, are rigged with explosives, and each is given the option to destroy the other to save themselves. And it's one of those moments where ethical ideals really get stress tested. Now, what makes the paper more interesting, or what makes the ferry dilemma more interesting, is the Joker's role in it. He isn't just a villain. He represents an entire moral viewpoint, moral nihilism. His belief is that morality is just a social illusion, something people pretend to hold on to until the chips are down. The whole ferry scenario, then, is really him trying to prove that when it comes down to it, nobody really acts morally. They act out of fear or self-preservation. They only act morally when it's convenient for them. It's a kind of forced experiment meant to expose the cracks in any moral theory. That belief, moral nihilism, it has echoes in real historical crisis. While I was writing the paper, I kept thinking about the Jamestown colony, especially during the starving time in the early 1600s. The colonists, cut off from supplies and surrounded by hostile conditions, were pushed to such desperate extremes that there are reports of cannibalism, including the exhumation and consumption of the dead. In this context, the structure of conventional morality didn't just bend, it broke. And when survival becomes the only goal, people often abandon their moral codes entirely. That's exactly the kind of point that the Joker is trying to make throughout the entire movie. That morality is a thin layer, easily stripped away when things fall apart. But that's only one angle. To really understand the ethics of the ferry problem, I wanted to compare two very different frameworks: utilitarianism, of course, and Kantian ethics. Starting with utilitarianism, this is the view that what's right is what creates the greatest good for the greatest number. It's all about outcomes. So if you're on one of those ferries and you're a utilitarian, which is a funny callback to the that one guy who's like, fine, nobody wants to get blood on their hands, I'll do it myself. He's a very good example of utilitarian thinking. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Sorry, I gotta get back on track. I kind of threw myself off. Anyway, so if you're on one of those ferries and you're a utilitarian, the logical thing to do would be to blow up the other ferry if it saves more lives overall. But it's not about who the people are, prisoners or civilians, but simply about the math. The least amount of pain and the most amount of survival. And while this can sound cold, it is also brutally practical. In the context of the Joker's game, where both ferries could die if no one acts, the utilitarian approach demands a decision. Do something, even if it's morally hard, to minimize the overall suffering, because if we do nothing, we all die. And that pretty much doubles the amount of pain that's going to be given. It's a mindset built for emergencies. That's its strength, but it's also its weakness. Because utilitarianism is so focused on consequences, it can justify treating people as numbers or as expendable if it benefits the majority. Now, Kantian ethics flips this completely. It's not about the consequences, it's about the moral principle behind the action. Immanuel Kant believed in duty, not results. So blowing up the other ferry, That's categorically wrong. Even if it saves more people, you're treating human beings as a means to an end, and that violates their dignity. Under Kantian ethics, every person has an intrinsic worth, and no amount of utility can justify violating that. Kant also says that moral duties hold even under pressure. So even when the Joker is manipulating everyone and the fear is overwhelming, the passengers still have the duty to act morally. They shouldn't allow fear to override their moral law. It's a high bar to clear, but it's also what makes the theory so uncompromising. Now, comparing the two, they offer completely different ways to answer the same question. Utilitarianism says, do the right thing that saves the most lives, and Kantian ethics says, do the thing that respects every life. And honestly, neither of them are perfect. Utilitarianism can be flexible and useful, especially when you have to act fast, but it can also justify some really horrific actions in the name of the greater good. On the other hand, Kantian ethics gives us a moral backbone. It protects human dignity even in the face of chaos. But sometimes that rigidity can feel unrealistic in a world that isn't fair or clean, especially in a world like Gotham or The Dark Knight. So where do I land? I think Kantian ethics gives the most morally legitimate response. Even if it's the harder path, in the Joker's world, where morality is being mocked and manipulated, sticking to moral duty becomes an act of resistance. Even if it's the only way to push it's the only way to push it back against the Joker's nihilism, by refusing to play his game, even if it risks everything. But in practice, I think the real world might need a balance, a kind of hybrid. Kantian ethics to ground us, and utilitarianism to guide action when lives are on the line. That synthesis could be the key to staying human even when humanity is under siege.